you looking for a different level of truth about your challenges and struggles? Then be a part of the Yes and podcast, hosted by empowerment strategist and trauma specialist Jennifer Whitacre. Every Wednesday, we challenge conventional thinking on topics like trauma, healing, and so much more. Learn life lessons and great nuggets of wisdom from guests who've moved through their pain and suffering to discover a new purpose in life. Now, here's your host, Jennifer Whitacre.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Whitacre, and you are here with me for another episode of Yes and. And if you have enjoyed the podcast in the past, please subscribe, please share, check us out on YouTube, and pass this along because I'm trying to put information out that can help others. And I'm really excited about today's guest, who's going to give us a different perspective on what it means to heal. Today's guest is Elliot Connor, and Elliot is the founder and CEO of the Human Nature Project, an international environmental charity supporting volunteers across 104 countries. Elliot is a TED speaker, author, podcast host, and filmmaker with a goal of reframing our human relationship with nature. So he's saving the planet at the tender age of 17 years old. Let that sink in for just a moment. Elliot has been awarded Samsung's 2020 Eco Hero Award, Young Citizen of the Year, and Young Land Care Leader. His mission is to develop a model for mass individualism, empowering future leaders to find their potential, connecting the connectors, and generating grassroots impact globally. From Quito, Ecuador, to KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, to quiet Sydney suburbs in Australia, he applies his leadership acumen and systems thinking to solve the most pressing issues of our 21st century. Elliot, it really is an honor to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thank you, Jennifer. Really looking forward to the conversation today. I think there's some really strong links to draw between getting out in nature and protecting these spaces and obviously protecting one's own well-being. I think we sometimes don't realise it, but we as humans are deeply, deeply interconnected with these natural systems. So hopefully provide some useful advice and insight into this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think probably a lot of people after what I've just read, and that introduction is really just a chip off of what all is in your entire CV. And some people, some of my listeners might not even know what a CV is. That's the fancy word for resume. It's the curriculum vitae. And so you have a lifetime of experience at 17 years old. So can you tell us in your own words just a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So, as you mentioned, I've been very lucky in these past few years to have some incredible opportunities. I started a Human Nature Project 12 months ago, and that certainly transformed my life. Some of the process behind setting that up, some of the connections it's built, and some of the insights it's given me into this space and how I can revolutionize it, cause it to evolve and grow ultimately. So, I'd say these past few years, I've been growing very much increasingly involved in the international environmental circles in this movement, which itself is relatively recent and modern as a phenomenon. I think for me, it's very much about storytelling and giving people the chance to connect with nature, to realize it, to decrease that knowledge gap, as some of those barriers we may face in appreciating and understanding the natural world. I think there's a wonderful power potential if we all can appreciate nature, respect it, show this compassion, and some of the wonderful services it provides to ourselves again. So in whether it may be mental health or it provides about 40% of the GDP is important for 80% of the sustainable development goals. So we really do depend on nature. And I think if we can reciprocate that relationship, if we can give back to nature just as much as it gives us, then that's what I'm working towards, giving people that chance to give back, but also to take and to learn from nature.
Yeah, and I get the impression that a lot of people mistakenly just take nature for granted. It's almost like the more, quote, civilized we become, the more distant we are from nature. And I guess if people really were to stop and think about it, everything that we have in our homes somehow comes from nature in one way or another. So what are some of your ideas, to get people started to reconnect with nature and to get past this delusion that somehow we're separate from nature, or even that we have the ability to control nature, which in my mind is just LOL laughable.
Yeah, yeah, it's a complex question.
It is.
The first way I'd suggest is what I call the Durrell effect. So it's named after Gerald Durrell, who's a brilliant author, wrote some amazing books, a wonderful figure, very famous conservationist, and effectively founder of the modern zoo. So he created this concept of zoos working conservation, and very, very influential figure in inspiring many others to connect with nature. But what the Durrell effect is if we can give people an opportunity to get out of nature and experience nature, whether it's through even a pet, so an animal's sort of companionship in the early age, or whether, as I do animal rescues, animal rehabilitation. So some of the wonderful bonds, relationships I build through that means, I think whatever it may be, or if they're visiting the local zoo, any way they can appreciate, learn about other animals, and slowly develop that bond with nature, I think is something which is inherent to all of us, especially with young children. They're sort of born with this fascination of the natural world. So if you can kindle that, really support it, nurture it from the beginning, then it's much easier to get people interested and fascinated in this subject. But I do think it's something which most people are very interested by. It's something which I think 4 billion years of evolution has assisted in us coming to understand and coming to inherently appreciate. I think it's small as some of these barriers we built up around ourselves. It's very much a psychological thing, how we look at nature, how we come to view our place in it. So
Yes.
it's that inbuilt resistance which we're trying to overcome. And some of those modern constructs you mentioned. So with 50-60% of us living in cities, that can be a barrier. So getting people to realise that nature still is all around us, whether I'm here in Sydney, a big mega city, or whether other people all across the world in huge urban settlements, there is still nature all around us. And giving people the chance to realise that, or even if they're watching an atom of a documentary. So making as many routes as possible, making that entry point into this field, this fascination in nature, very, very accessible is the most important part for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there was a lot in there. And, as somebody who helps people get beyond some of the subtle lifelong effects, especially of developmental and intergenerational trauma, I encourage my clients to reconnect with nature in whatever way that means to them. I mean, it doesn't mean that you have to, start tent camping and, being really primitive. I mean, you don't have to go to that extreme and, spend weeks. And at the same time, you mentioned even having a pet and gardening, and having like raised bed gardens, even if you just have a few in your little lot or your yard, is becoming more and more popular in the United States. And even something as simple as that, like having raised beds, or, growing, like a few tomato plants in flower pots, anything. Yeah. Something that simple, or having houseplants, can help you reconnect with nature, because it doesn't matter whether it's a plant or an animal. You're developing and learning a nonverbal skill set on how to communicate with something of an entirely different species. And there is communication that happens between humans and plants, and between, humans and their pets. Can you talk a little bit to that communication, and what's that experience like for you? Because I can't imagine that you don't have a conscious awareness of communicating with nature with what you do.
Yeah. I think it's something which, if you are involved in caring for other animals, caring for their needs over a month, 2 months, then you do develop a relationship, to come to understand that creature on a certain level. And I think it is important. What nature gives us more than anything is perspective on our own lives and those of others. So if we are experiencing difficulties in our life, then it lends some of that high level view to it all. For example, one of the most recent animals that came into care I had out back was a tawny frogmouth. So it's like an owl, basically an owl. It's nocturnal birds, and they're some of my favourite creatures, but they basically spend their entire lives sitting immobile on branches. They rely heavily on camouflage, so they're impeccably coloured, just like a rotting log. And they have this certain stillness, but I find it very charismatic in a sense as well. It's one of those things where you have to give it the time and the space. I remember Attenborough in his Private Life of Plants made some comment like, if we don't appreciate plants because they act on a different time scale, all of their conflicts, all of their romance happens 100 times slower than it does for us. So I think some of the important value we get from recommuning with nature is simply from the perspective it lends us, and having to slow down, having to take everything in, having to really get inside another creature's mind, which is very difficult. So we've got some of our best scientists on it, mapping animal languages in hundreds of dimensions, trying to decode it all. But still, if you can really try and get inside that creature's mind, understand what it's thinking, then you're 75% of the way there. You do get to understand and appreciate that creature very intimately, especially if it's injured. You're seeing it gain strength, gain confidence, and eventually releasing it. So that's some of the privilege I get in work I do. It's an incredible experience for me.
Yeah. And I'm curious, your ability to form relationships with nature, with animals, has that in any way enhanced your ability to form relationships and communicate with your fellow humans?
Oh, that's a good question. I would imagine so. Yes. Yeah. It definitely teaches you empathy and compassion. You have to really, really try to connect with animals. I mean, mammals are something we naturally gravitate to because they're very similar to ourselves, to humans. But I say, even if it's a frogmouth, it's a bird, then that's something we don't naturally understand. The slow bird brains emerged in a few centuries back because when scientists were looking at the neuroscience of birds, they couldn't find this seat of intelligence in birds. So it had a different anatomy to the human brain, and that caused them to obviously assume they were unintelligent, but that was because they didn't imagine there could be a parallel structure. Of course, that's been found. We know birds are incredibly intelligent now. But that's just an example of not making this attempt to connect with animals on their own level. So I think if you can develop that skill set, if you can learn to appreciate animals on their level, say do conservation for conservation's sake instead of because it's economically good, because it's socially acceptable, whatever it may be. But I think if we can really try and understand animals for what they are, see the humanity in them, change our perspective that dramatically, then that's a skill set that definitely transfers to building teams, whether it's my charity, Human Age projects, whether it's my relationships in life, whatever it may be. I think it's something which definitely assists you greatly. And as I mentioned, starting up human nature projects and everything that's followed has caused me to have to step up. And that's been a journey that has taken me a lot. It's not easy. I'm a natural introvert. So it's something which definitely takes adapting to. So that's something I've learned from animal rescues, animal caring, and building these relationships, as you mentioned.
Yeah. And so what you said in there is really important. And that's one of the reasons, like learning to communicate with animals. And you stated it so beautifully, because you can essentially kind of meet the animal where they are, because you learn that language. And if you can learn that with an animal that doesn't speak your language at all, then it becomes more natural with people. And that's one of the problems with people, is the intention behind my words as I'm speaking is not always perceived by the listener the way I intend it to be. And that causes conflict. That intention perception gap causes conflict. And so if you can, and it's something that just happens naturally and unconsciously and non-verbally, we don't even realize it. So the greater connection we have with nature, whether it's with plants or animals, it enhances that capacity within each of us to meet people where they are. And I love also that you mentioned bird brain, because I want to kind of pause for a moment when it comes to the neurobiology of the brain. And so often we have referred to the different parts of the human brain as the reptilian brain and the mammalian brain and the primate brain, which indicates a hierarchy of functioning. And just like you said, we have learned over time that hierarchy is not true. So I teach classes in resiliency, and pulling in the neurobiology is important. So even in the classes I teach, we have changed the language. I don't use reptilian brain and mammalian brain. I'll use the little hand model to talk about it. So down here on the wrist, you have your survival brain. And then your thumb, as you oppose it, is your limbic brain. And then what folds over is your cortex, which is your executive functioning in that frontal lobe. So that's how I explain the structure of the brain, but the functioning, there's the hierarchy has been debunked. And that's, and I think that's important for people to understand too, because we still have that hierarchical thinking, and it's just not so. And somewhere in there you mentioned, what was the book? The Secret Life of Trees? Was that it? Or The Secret Life of Plants? And
The Private Life of Plants.
The Private Life of Plants. And I've read the book, The Secret Life of Trees, and I'm just curious, did the book, The Private Life of Plants, did it talk about how plants communicate with each other and even how trees migrate?
No, so that's very recent research, but fascinating.
It
stuff.
is. It's fascinating how they'll communicate under the earth with their root systems. And I'm wondering if you understand that, and if you can explain it maybe better than I can, because I don't think we realize that plants communicate with each other. And trees, they're finding a migration of trees here in America. And which to me is fascinating that trees can migrate, but they're doing it.
So I think it's colloquially being called the Wood Wide Web, which is play on words, obviously, but underground, these massive root systems of the trees, and it's called mycorrhizal fungi. So these fungal mats which connect them all allow basically for this entire vegetative community to transfer information, be it about the weather one season back, or be it nutrients between their roots. So I read something really interesting recently, which was that parent trees actually favour their young, so they provide them with extra sustenance, extra resources through this wide web. And of course, as you say, they transfer information. So if it's been a particularly chilly season before, then that's something which will be passed through this community for the younger saplings to learn to adapt to give them that extra head start, knowing what to expect and what may come, what they have to be prepared for. Recently read an interesting news story about a concert they did. It was the Bologna Opera House, and they played a classical, I think it was string quartet for several thousand potted plants. So I think that's an interesting idea. I don't think we have any evidence of plants communicating on that level, but they do engage in much more complex discussions, communications, interactions than we could have imagined. So it's just this past decade even that this much has come to light, and it's something we're increasingly coming to understand, to learn about. But again, as we say, it's something we couldn't have expected, because it's something completely foreign to our human brains, to how we function, how we see the world. So being able to get down on that level to appreciate when an alien form of life, an alien communication system, is incredibly complex, and it's something we're just starting to understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I find it incredibly fascinating, because in many ways I feel like nature is just almost like a mirror of ourselves to some degree, because if we understand nature and we understand the cycles and the laws of nature, we understand ourselves on so much deeper of a level. And again, not saying that we have, like roots that are encased in, fungi or what's the word, mycelium, under the earth that causes us to communicate. And at the same time, like we do know that, our emotions will emit a frequency that other people pick up on. I think it was in 2016 at MIT in their CSAIL lab, which is Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab. They created an EQ radio. And we've known for eons that, you can put electrodes on people, and through an ECG, you can measure human emotion by measuring the physiology of respiration and heart rate. Well, now this EQ radio, you can set about 4 feet away from somebody, and it can pick up the same information without putting electrodes on people. So it's proving that our emotions do emit a vibration. And so we have this vast network of nonverbal communication about us that science is in the embryonic stages of understanding right now. And it's so important, I think, to explore that and to understand it. And I love that, one of the things that one of your missions is to reframe our human relationship with the natural world. So in an ideal scenario, what would the ideal human relationship with the natural world be?
In an ideal scenario, yeah, I think it's a lot of what we've talked about already, actually. It's about appreciating animals for what they are, but it's equally about understanding what we are as humans. So taking into account that we are animals, understanding where we fit in on this earth, and trying to look at animals essentially as equals, as humans, if you will, but then understanding them also for what they are. And I think if we can give nature rights, give animals rights, and enhance that understanding, so on their own terms, but also integrating them into our human systems, if need be, into our societal constructs, then it's not going to be easy, but that will be a way in which we certainly can revolutionize how we interact with other animals. There's an infinite amount of knowledge stored in these natural systems, which we can learn, which we get out of them, and an infinite amount of pleasure, joy from just appreciating them. So if we can take some of that on board, really understand how much we own nature, then I think that would be a sort of pathway towards giving it this increased significance in our human systems. And if we can do that by 2050, 2100, as we reach this peak in our population, as things slowly begin to stabilize. I know COVID is a hard time to imagine it in, but if we can bring this very rapid expansion, growth, economic development into an equilibrium, and develop a sort of world order, worldview in which we can thrive alongside other animals. So, in which they are given opportunities to live out on their own terms. There's a wonderful idea, which is the Nature Needs Half project. So, if we can set aside 50% of the planet for these animals, 50% of the lands, 50% of the oceans, give them all that space, all of that time, without human pressures to undermine their integrity, then that would be wonderful. But really, it's about appreciating animals and protecting them for their own sake, as opposed to for any human gain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious, from your perspective, Elliot, what is one of, or are a couple of the biggest obstacles that we face in reframing our relationship with the natural world?
Well, we've talked about a few of them. So some of them are these mental blocks. Mm-hmm. We've spent centuries trying to work out why humans are unique, why we're so special, man the tool maker, why we can have such complex language, such complex culture, communication, all of these things which are found in other animals, but we don't take time to look for them or appreciate them because we want to understand how special we are. We need this purpose for existence. So trying to define ourselves, I think, has historically separated us from animals. But I think one of the major ones we face today is just the knowledge gap. So most people don't take 2 minutes, 2 seconds to reconnect with nature, understand it. And that means they really struggle to start out this journey. So I recently did a survey of about 1,000 members of the public, looking at what they knew about the current state of our environmental systems. And very simple questions. There was 8 multiple choice, and people actually got worse in random chance. So they would have done much better guessing. There's systematic bias in the way we view this world. It's that skewed, that thwarted, that they're just not able to have the foggiest idea of what's going on. And that can be quite damaging if we're trying to get people to go down into this environmental field to start down this journey. So I think a large part of it is giving people an opportunity to learn more about nature, to connect with animals we mentioned on their own level, and whether it is a pet, a zoo, or animal rescues, animal caring, at whatever level you want to engage on, finding the means to do so, regardless of where you are, there's always a chance.
Yeah, and in there you mentioned, there's like systematic bias. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Maybe give an example of, what you found?
Yes, so a major one we found was just a pessimism, which I think can be very damaging. So we have a very negative worldview right now. Obviously, these systems are becoming worse in many cases. There are horrible examples of animals going extinct, being rationally exploited. That's how COVID arose. So we're living in the world we've created from that today. I think, though, we do need to take things somewhat in perspective. So several of the questions were about how things were or weren't improving, and people go overwhelmingly for incredibly negative responses. Impossible that they are. One question was about the Amazon bushfires. It was how much of the Brazilian Amazon had been destroyed in that event. You could choose 20, 50, or 80%. The correct answer is about 20%, but the overwhelming majority chose 80%. So they thought almost the entirety of it had been lost from this incident. It's something which is a very simple example of how we view the world. We just assume everything's gone awfully wrong, and that does lead to an apathy. We think we can't fix it. We think we've really screwed it up too far. We're past this tipping point. We can't go back. But I think there's always that opportunity to hit the rewind button if we can frame this relationship we as humans hold with nature and some of our interactions with these systems. I think that can be a major inhibitor. So we definitely need hope, as well as some of this perspective. It's one of the main motivators we see in environmentalism. The reason so many people want to help out. It's overwhelming a sense of community spirit within environmentalism, which really helps. It supports these ventures. I think hope is very important, especially in these times, and overcoming some of that innate pessimism in our worldview is one of these biases we saw.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you very much for that. In there you talked a little bit about, like why humans are unique and what makes us different from the other animals. I'm curious what your answer is to that. What does separate us from other animals?
Yeah. So
I know what I think, so I want to compare answers.
Yeah. So actually, during the lockdown here in Sydney, I wrote a book on this subject. It was my way of passing the time. I stuck at home, and I came to the conclusion about halfway through that humans can be defined as opportunistic ecosystem engineers. So it's a biological description deliberately, so reducing us to animal terms. But opportunistic means we make the most of damaged, fractured environments, challenging spaces to live in, often of our own creation, but making the most of non-conventional habitats. So that's how we've come to live our lives. That's how we've come to be, quote unquote, the dominant species, this major force on Earth. And the second part, ecosystem engineers, just means that we change the environment around us. So that's a particular skill set we happen to have. Other animals have it, just as they have the opportunism. So rats are opportunistic. They do very well. Brown rats can be found everywhere except Alaska, I think. Pretty much anywhere where you can find ecosystem engineers, maybe beavers. So they radically change the environment around them. Beavers by creating dams. There's the wonderful story of Yellowstone. So when they introduced the wolves there, that meant the beavers could thrive. They changed the course of the rivers. Everything changed. So it revolutionized that ecosystem, certainly. But humans do a similar thing in many ways. We're able to radically alter our surroundings in ways which are either good or bad for the environment. So that's a choice we definitely have to make. But yeah, that's the conclusion I came to. I was partly refuting some of the alternatives, so communication, culture, complex collaboration, whatever it may be. All these traits we find in animals, but trying to define what it means to be human is challenging.
It is.
Some would argue a futile exercise.
Yeah.
That's the conclusion I came to.
Okay. I like that answer. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on my answer. So my answer is it's kind of almost two parts, but both parts are kind of the same, but kind of different. The first part is humans, we apply meaning to things that happen. And so we pull our emotions into it, and we make up stories around what happens. So humans are meaning-making machines, and that's a problem sometimes because the meaning that we apply to things becomes, we have this woman in America, her name's Brene Brown, and she talks about the story you tell yourself. And so that meaning becomes the story you tell yourself. And the story you tell yourself, if you don't examine whether or not that story is true, that can become a problem, because then it becomes a belief. And belief is a big problem if we don't explore our beliefs. And, if you don't put your belief to the test, what's the use of having a belief anyway? But that's a whole different podcast episode. And the second part of it is, I think humans are, from what I can tell, the only species on the planet, in my mind, that can override an instinct or a gut feeling and just do whatever anyway. I don't know any other animal that can override their instincts the way humans can. So there you have the ego and the persona that creates a problem. So I'm just curious what your take is on my thoughts.
Yeah, I think for the most part, those points I'd wholeheartedly agree with. I think it's certainly part of the human condition that we try and find excessive layers of meaning in our own existence. We try and define what it means to be human, what it means to be me, myself, how I can understand my place in this world, what the meaning of life is for me and for others, and what sense I can make of my place in the grand scheme of things. So that definitely is part of the human condition, that we try and make a sense of all of this. I think it's often very hard to know to what degree other animals may engage in philosophy, if you want to call it that. I think there's the concept of the Umwelt, which is basically the answer to everything in this field. The Umwelt is the concept that we exist in this bubble, this sphere, which is our own existence, and we can never quite step fully out of that perspective. We have to interpret the world around us in the way we've learned to, in the way that makes sense to ourselves, in the way that ultimately separates us from be it other humans or other animals. And there are ways of trying to break down some of those boundaries, but there will always be that gap in how much we can understand, and the difference between the Umwelt of a human and of an elephant or a whale is much greater, some would argue, than between two humans. So we really, really struggle to know whether animals have emotions, whether they are conscious, whether they can philosophize. So it's something which 50 years' time I may be able to give you a more comprehensive answer to. But I suspect until then, we won't have a clue. There are some incredibly intelligent creatures on this planet. So like sperm whales are arguably the most intelligent, besides humans or including humans, whichever way you want to argue it, creatures we can barely understand. They have a communication system which we're just starting to decode, but it is effectively a language all of their own, and very, very complex family relations, social structures, essentially human characteristics we may try and find ourselves with, or which we may attribute to feeling emotions. So they certainly feel some sort of loyalty to their families. They may be able to override like a survival instinct to protect a calf, for example, but you may argue that's another instinct. How do you define instincts? How do you define feelings or rational thoughts in an observed frame? It's very, very difficult to pick it all apart. But I think for the most part, what you say, I definitely agree with. It all comes back to a quote that Darwin said, that the difference between humans and animals is one of degree and not of kind. So I suspect that with new research, we'll find these traits, these characteristics in other animals, but humans clearly do possess them to a very large degree.
Yes. Yeah. And I also, I'm not sure that animals, I don't even know what the word would be, anthropomorphize humans the way we do them. I know that's one of my favorite things to do. I'll sit on my back porch and all the critters that visit my yard, like I make up stories about, who's related to whom and what's the story. It's how I pass my time sometimes in the morning when I'm having my cup of tea. It's fun to live in my head sometimes. But I'm going to circle back because a few minutes ago when you were talking about the environment, there was another part in there. I kind of picked one part. I want to go back and pick another part because you mentioned that it's not too late. We can still rewind and possibly save the environment, save the planet. And I'm hoping that that's the case. And so I do have hope. And I'm just curious, we haven't hit a rewind button yet. However, COVID has kind of almost forced us to hit the pause button a little bit. Are you seeing an impact at all since COVID has started, and the impact on nature just in, 5 months in right now? Working on 6?
Yeah, COVID has been a double-edged sword for the environment. There have been some really interesting stories of how nature has changed in the absence of humans. So some stories of nature returning, say turtles nesting in Thai beaches where previously tourism was too high, so they weren't able to, where light pollution, noise pollution was disrupting those cycles. But yeah, the absence of human activity has caused some form of regeneration, some very minor form of reset, almost a rewind, if you will. So before some of these major industries took off, almost like Chernobyl example. So when that area became inhabitable to humans, then nature did return. So almost similar to that, adapted to these new conditions in the radioactive zone. There is a tremendous resilience in nature. So being able to take these opportunities, and it has come back in many ways. The flip side to that, you may argue, is we as humans have been stalled in some of our progress towards greater environmental action. We've recognized to some level the link between our interactions with animals, the illegal wildlife trade, and the emergence of COVID, being a zoonotic disease, so coming likely from bats, possibly from pangolins or other animals. I've heard a few explanations. But I think 2020 was meant to be this biodiversity super year. So lots of major conferences, lots of major discussions, world leaders gathering, hopefully huge, ambitious plans we can imagine may very possibly have come out of it. So that's been delayed a year at least until this whole scenario dies down. So that has been a difficulty to work with, and we've seen tremendous solidarity come out as well. So communities are mobilising around all sorts of issues, be it COVID or be it environmental sustainability. It's a time to reflect, certainly, as we are seeing that, and it's causing a suite of knock-on effects to nature. It's just showing how closely we're interconnected, I think. It's showing that we humans, our human health certainly is very, very sensitive to the state of the natural world. We're heavily reliant on these ecosystem services to get by, and heavily dependent on nature to restore this balance of diseases, of the carbon cycle, of oxygen, whatever it may be. So I think it's a pause button, yes. It's time for reflection. Where we're going to go next, that's a big question. It's something, who knows what the answer is, but we can certainly hope that some good things will come out of it. It's been a realization, I think, for many people on the state of things and what might be required to fix them. The question will be getting it there soon enough to prevent the worst of the damage, and we're very much racing against time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right that a lot of people have gone into that, into reflection. Not everybody, but a lot of people have since, we've hit the pause button for COVID. And something else that, we've mentioned and just kind of loosely alluded to is a couple times already, is that humans are subject to the same laws of nature, that nature is the same cycles. And I'm wondering if you might be able to talk to that a moment and maybe give an example of one of the laws of nature, or, one or two that we are subject to that most people don't recognize or don't acknowledge, that we're subject to the same laws as the natural world.
Yeah, so earlier this year, I gave a TEDx talk called Evolution and How to Save the World. Basically, the idea behind this, the framework, was taking 5 laws of nature, of evolution, and applying them to a human context. So what we might learn from them in how to step forward as societies, how to adapt to create a new world order, which is more sustainable for humans and animals. So that was a really interesting exercise for me, I think. It just showed me how much we can learn from nature, how much our perspective can change if we try and take what learnings we can from the natural world, from the systems it engages with. One of the interesting ones to look at is the effect of small changes adding up. So it's cumulative process. Say if it's mutations in genes allowing for evolution to take place. So as generations go by, small changes, small errors in the gene code are allowing tiny variations, many of which are false starts and many of which don't succeed, but a few of which are brilliant, and they allow these animals to create new species, to survive long into the future, to found long evolutionary dynasties, lines, successions, which are the success stories of nature, which have survived down these 4 billion years to come to us and to give rise to modern humans, if you will. So the birth of ourselves. But if we take a similar idea, we can learn that, say, small amounts of carbon emissions. So if we're constantly polluting the atmosphere, greenhouse effect runs away, and we reach this tipping point where we're currently facing a climate crisis. So It shows these small changes can add up. And that's what we've seen in the accelerating rate of climate change, global warming, and the current climate. Or you can look at what happens if we start protecting marine protected areas or terrestrial national parks. If we start setting land aside for nature, so taking a positive example, and in the past 60, 70 years of conservation, we've set aside about 15% of the world's area, mostly on the land, some in the sea, to revive. And that has created some positive effects. So it's one of those minor success stories when they recount, and it shows how far we've come in a relatively brief span of time, but also how far we have to go. So reaching that 50% I mentioned, ideally by 2050, and some of the great sweeping impacts that might have. But if we can just set small tracts of land aside, if we can be strategic in how we do so, and learn from nature, and not being too precious about our attempts. So being prepared to drop unsuccessful ideas, being prepared to take that leap of faith, ideate, and opt for those options which seem to work. Give them a go, and if evolution, if the process of time, the trials and error shows them to be invalid, to not be as effective as we may have hoped, then being prepared to drop and try something else, but being persistent in the process. So following that evolutionary process to evolve our own human systems as well, could be potentially very, very revolutionary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I live in a country where environmental protections are being rolled back. So I feel and this is just my personal perception, is that we're going in the wrong direction in our country. So I'm curious if you have any advice on what we can do individually, and with what we can control in our personal lives, in our homes, even if we live in a concrete jungle in the inner city and might not have a lot of trees on our streets, or because not all communities have tree-lined streets. So what can the average everyday person start to do to help or contribute, while also living in a country that, that's not on the same page?
Yeah. So you're definitely right. The US has the second most threatened species of any country. Well, I'm in Australia's third, so just behind. But neither country's a great example of governments leading the way. It's definitely way backwards in terms of environmental policy. I think on the individual scale, there's lots you can do. So if you have the time and the skill set, then volunteering with an environmental organisation. So Human Nature Projects is designed as a community of people who don't know how to help out, but giving them that support opportunity to do so. I think on you mentioned the property level. So if you're in a street without any trees, then creating, say, a microhabitat in your backyard. If you can plant some flowers for pollinators, for bees, create these microhabitats which are connected to create these great urban strips of nature. And there's been some really, really interesting research in how, say, the loss of front lawns, I think in the UK, has caused decline in biodiversity because people are cementing them over. But if you can try and keep as much greenery as possible in your life, whether it's planting trees on the roof, keeping something up there, or if it's a green wall you want to add, even if you don't have a backyard, front lawn, whatever it may be, that's a great way you can help. Or just learning about nature can be brilliant. So if you take 10 minutes a day to learn a new bird species, new bird call, then be a way of learning about the nature all around you and sharing that with others. It's this process by which the environmental movement has thrived, has evolved, has developed over these past 60, 70 years, gradually coming to become this universal constant, something which everyone's come to love, appreciate at some level. It's incredible how diverse, how multi-talented people we see working in the space are, and I think that's just credit to the community behind it. So I think it's not an easy question to give a
Right.
one-line answer to.
Exactly.
But if you do have the desire to help, then there are many ways to do so. And
Right.
listeners are interested, and definitely reach out to me.
Yeah.
I'm happy to support them in that process. It's something which keeps on giving back working in this field.
Right. Well, and I love that part of your answer was just even to learn something, like learn about, read a few minutes a day, or, learn about a new bird species or something once a week, because in my experience, I'm one of those weirdos that I'll read books written by ornithologists or nature experts, and because I love it. And nonfiction is my genre. So across the board. So when I read books about nature, that's my pleasure reading rather than my work-related reading. Anyhow, it is amazing how just learning a little bit more about a species that you didn't know can enhance your appreciation and your gratitude for that species. And whenever we have more appreciation and more gratitude for anything, it impacts our relationship, whatever that thing is. So anything that we can do to learn and understand, because if you approach the learning with curiosity rather than judgment, which learning is curiosity. If you're being judgmental, then you're not in the state of mind to learn. You can't receive information if you're in a state of judgment. So anytime we can learn something, and we're in that state of receiving, whether it's information or whatever it is, that is linked to gratitude, on a deep spiritual level. And I work with emotions, and gratitude is actually the ultimate state of receiving. So when people come to me and they're upset that they're not getting back what they think they should be getting back from somebody or something or life or the world in general, my question is, tell me about gratitude in your life. Tell me about your practice of gratitude. And if they don't have a practice of gratitude, they're not going to put themselves into a state of receiving. Because gratitude, if you think about the times in life when you're most grateful, it's usually when something has come to you, or you've just received something, or something has come your way. And so they're closely linked, and education is a way to help us get closer and closer to gratitude to receive. So, again, that might be getting a little bit more deep into, some of the work that I do around emotional wellness and health. And it's also linked. It's really, really important information. So even just learning about nature can have more of an impact than you would imagine. Because most people, when they learn something new, they want to share it with somebody, like, whoa, did you know this? I'm like that about ravens all the time. The more I learn about the corvid family, oh my gosh, it's one of my favorite birds. They fascinate me. It's so intelligent, and I can bore people to death with the useless little stories that I have about crows and ravens and blue jays and just corvids in general. Yeah.
One of my first volunteering placements was at a discovery centre for BirdLife Australia. Just in a local park, like a mini museum, teaching members of the public about local birds. And there was a story we used to tell because it was just outside of a golf course, and the ravens there had learned to pick up and stash these golf balls, which they found. So they were quite well known for picking out these dozens of golf balls from be it skip bins or be it whichever cavities they could find to store them in. And it was really incredible where we could find them. But yes, it's just one story we had of incredibly intelligent birds.
Mm-hmm. They are. The place where I go to buy bird seed and bird food, I buy peanuts in the shell for the crows around here. And they would set out a little handful of peanuts in the shell in front of the store every day. And the crows would take the the crows would take the peanuts, and they would go to a neighboring business, and they were stuffing the peanuts in the air conditioning unit. And so And it was the birds who was doing it, but they had to put a stop to feeding the crows peanuts because they're so ornery. They're mischievous little birds.
There's that wonderful story of a woman in Europe who took to feeding was magpies in her backyard, and they learned to tap on the window to get her attention, to ask for more food. So eventually this developed to them learning to use the doorbell. They rang the doorbell multiple times and she had no idea what it was. So it took half a dozen attempts, but eventually she worked it out. And they'd learned to operate this doorbell mechanism to catch her attention. And her husband didn't like it at all. He took to threatening to throw things at them. So
That's
they
not
learned
wise.
to defecate on his car from the windscreen. So they just followed him around, basically, taunting him. So it's incredible what these birds can do. And where you are in the US, there's another story about, I think it was a crow that learned to call all the dogs in the neighborhood. So he summoned them and he led them over to a local university. So when the bell rang and the students came out, he flew low over all the students and the dogs followed. So it caused absolute chaos. But it's incredible birds.
They are. They're absolutely amazing. I have crows, like I said, that I feed that come to my backyard every day, and I recognize them. You know, I've got one crow that has a white feather on each wing. He's really quite handsome. I don't know if it's a he. I have assumed. I don't know. But yeah, this is such a fascinating conversation. I'm really enjoying this. And if any of the listeners, Elliot, are interested in connecting with you, what's the best way for them to do so if they want to look you up or, even reach out and send you an email?
Sure. So you can find my website, which is elliotconnor.com. You can reach me through there, or you can find my charity's website, which is humannatureprojects.org, or you can head over to my podcast, which is called Human Nature, with episodes released every Wednesday.
Okay, wonderful. And I also have your social media links. I will make sure that I put the links you just referenced in the show notes, as well as your social media links, as too. So so for anybody who's just listening, elliotconnor.com. And I do encourage you, if you're listening and not reading or watching this podcast, to take the time to go to the show notes and check out some of the links. Elliot has some really fantastic information out in the world. And I'm also going to put a link to your TEDx talk, which is a fantastic, informative TEDx talk. And I encourage you to listen to that as well. It's really been fascinating. And so I hope people will, just pause and really think about our relationship with nature a little bit and think about, how can you connect with nature, even if it is learning and reading and learning something new, because it's amazing how much we can learn about ourselves just from learning and understanding more about nature. I know I've had a lot of aha moments, just being in nature and just observing, just sitting and watching even the activity in my backyard. It's fantastic. And Elliot, I'm curious, before we finally sign off today, do you have any final tips or bits of wisdom to leave with our listeners?
Yeah, all I'd say is if you can give nature the time and space, be able to integrate it into your understanding of the world, into your daily routine, then it's definitely worth the time. It's definitely effort. Nature is one of those realms where we understand incredibly little, but if you can start wandering at the animals around you, witnessing them in your daily lives, then it's an endless source of entertainment, as you say. Fascinating creatures and incredible characters. So it's definitely something which is well worth getting into for yourself and for the sake of nature as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Elliot. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show today. And Again, my name's Jennifer Whitacre, and you have listened to another episode of Yes and. If you found this information helpful, which I hope you did, please subscribe, please share. Feel free to share this on social media, send it to people, because nature is so important, and we are subject to the same laws of nature as the natural world. And the more that we can connect with nature, the more we connect with ourselves. And I know that sounds a little counterintuitive, and at the same time, it's true. It's hard to put into words until you actually take the time to experience it. So I encourage all of you to find a way to connect with nature and really to reestablish that connection with yourself through a connection with nature. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. You can find me at jenniferwhitacre.com. And my podcast page is on my website. I'm on Facebook. I'm on LinkedIn. And I look forward to seeing all of you next week.
We have just concluded another episode of the Yes and podcast with Jennifer Whitacre. For additional resources, please visit our website, jenniferwhitacre.com. Leave a review if you enjoyed the show and find it useful. Until next time, continue challenging conventional thinking and keep moving forward.